Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you every week. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me from his home in Arlington, a suburb of Washington, D.C., is Shaka Sal himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Ndugu Paul.
How are you?
Well, not particularly terrific because of a loss of a very, very dear friend in Dar es Salaam, the Tanzanian commercial capital, who became a victim of COVID-19 in a country, by the way, where the president seems to say that it's not a big problem. And yet, there are reports from so many sources that a lot of people, including my friend, are actually dying of the same.
Shaka Sali, my deepest condolences to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ndugu Paul.
Let's start here in the U.S. Capitol, where the U.S. Congress or the U.S. Senate voted to acquit President Donald Trump. President Trump has been a very, very lucky guy. At the same time, a very unfortunate guy. He's the one guy who has been impeached twice, but at the same time acquitted twice. And in this particular case, it was more bipartisan. But the fact that it was bipartisan, it does not mean he got convicted. So basically, he got off the hook.
Talking about bipartisanship, it still remains a very, very significant effort by the Congress. Mind you, this is for the history books, even though it fell 10 votes short to convict. Because you needed 2/3 of the number of the senators, who are 100, to convict. But you got 57 vis-a-vis 43, which meant you got all the 50 members of the Senate who represent the Democratic Party, and you got 7 members of the Republican Party, which also, by the way, is made up of 50 members of the Republican Party in the Senate. It is a 50-50 Senate. And it is, in fact, by every indication, very historic in the sense that, as you said rightly, it is the most bipartisan vote of conviction of a president in the Senate in U.S. history. So it's very significant. And mind you, this was a political trial. You are apparently likely to have other trials, which will probably be sort of spin-offs from this impeachment. You're talking about the state of Georgia, for example, which is investigating pretty much the same thing. And it's quite possible that when it comes to the jury in the state of Georgia, it is very unlikely to look at that particular case unfavorably, because you are talking about politics. With the Republican Party, the members of the Senate are sort of scared of the support that Donald J. Trump enjoys from his base of supporters. And so as they vote, they constantly think in terms of the Republican primaries, which should be around the corner in 2 years' time. But when it comes to a criminal charge brought against Donald J. Trump, it is very likely to be a totally different ballgame. Because when it comes to a criminal charge, it is basically driven either by the facts or by the law, or both, which is very much unlike a political trial, which in this particular case which in this particular case seem to have overlooked both the facts and the law and the circumstances, and basically pretty much focused on the politics of the case.
You make a very good distinction there. Maybe for purposes of our audience, can you explain the two terms, a political trial? What do we mean by a political trial as opposed to a criminal trial? Because what we saw here, it was more of a political trial.
A political trial, Ndugu Paul, means that the members of the Senate, which is the upper house of Congress, become the jurors. They become the jurors, and in fact, the president pro tem, the senior most Democratic Party Senator Leahy, was presiding over that particular case as if, in fact, he were the Chief Justice. Whereas when it comes to a criminal case, you are actually going to have judges in the chair. It is going to be a judge, and he is going to have a jury, a grand jury made up of civilians who are in a situation or position of judging that particular case in a manner that is devoid of politics. They will only be guided by the facts and the law. So that is the difference.
I'm not a lawyer, but I've had arguments of people who said that in most cases, when it comes to whether criminal or political trials, the facts that a lot of people talk about are all relative, depending on what side of the aisle or what side you are on.
I'm afraid the last time I checked, facts have never been relative. Facts are facts, and the facts are essentially a universal value. As a matter of fact, the only people in recent memory that attempted to come up with that point of view or shared that kind of point of view in terms of the manner in which it reflects your question were senior members in the Donald J. Trump administration who actually said that they are alternative facts. There is no such a thing as alternative facts. What there is, Ndugu Paul, is that all of us human beings may be entitled to the right to own an opinion, but certainly not the right to own different sets of facts. Facts are facts, and they are universal.
The US President, Joe Biden, over the weekend, while reacting to this acquittal of the former president for inciting an insurrection, he said that this was a reminder that democracy is very fragile. What did he exactly mean by those words? Especially for purposes of our audiences, when we talk about democracy, a lot of people look at the US system of government as a benchmark for democratic governments all over the world. So for the US president to say that democracy was very fragile, try to explain that to our audience.
I suppose what he meant really was that democracy, just like political pundits often say, is a work in progress. It is something that you constantly have to protect. It is something that is in place because a majority of people observe the values that reflect social, economic, cultural, political justice. Democracy is there because of human beings. Human beings sometimes can be fickle, sometimes can be weak, sometimes tend to be influenced, sometimes tend to be political animals, and therefore, at some times, can actually be complacent so that things could actually end up getting out of hand. So I suppose what he was saying, he was basically saying, yes, democracy, as far as the United States is concerned, is resilient, but it can be fragile. If we do not protect it, we could actually end up losing it. I think that's what he meant.
Let's go to some of our comments. Let's start in Nigeria. Let's go to Adola Ita. He says that perhaps what we saw in the United States could not be further from what has been going on in the United States. There are two justice systems when it comes to white people versus black, brown, and other races. He said a black person or any other person of color could not have gotten away with what former US President Donald Trump did. And even the way the Senate voted shows that there are two justice systems in America.
I am afraid that to some degree, my brother Adola Ita of the great nation of Nigeria, the land of the ogres, may have a point. As a matter of fact, you normally hear about that controversial issue on television. Anytime you switch on an American television, you run into those types of arguments. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of people who even said the last vote in the Senate, which fell short of convicting the former president, reflected more of a resistance to the changing or the changes that could occur in the lifestyle of the dominant culture. And when you talk about the dominant culture in the United States, you are basically looking at the political majorities who happen to be white. That in fact, the Republican senators who voted against conviction, they were not voting against conviction because they did not really find evidence or facts that clearly suggested that former President Donald J. Trump was in the wrong, but that rather they were simply trying to use the procedural route, the procedures, so as in fact to protect their lifestyle.
Shaka, I was remarkably impressed by one of the House managers, one of the people making the case to impeach President Trump. And I'm talking about an Eritrean American who came here, whose parents came here as a refugee. For him, he has since then, he was born here, but he obviously has roots in Africa. And he said some of the things that I found to be very, very profound. For example, to quote him directly, he said that Donald Trump will be remembered as the first president to be impeached twice. He fed the myth of the election, that the election was stolen, summoned his supporters to Washington to protest the certification of the Electoral College vote, told them that only through strength they could take back their country, and stood by as they stormed the US Capitol and interfered with the operation of a constitutional government. I thought that was very profound. And when you look at all the other house managers, most of them seem to look like you and I, people who come from different parts of the world. Here they are trying, a U.S. president in the U.S. Senate.
Are you talking about Negusi?
Absolutely.
Negusi from the great state of Colorado.
Correct. Yes.
I think I agree with you that he is, in fact, a remarkable achiever. Because I remember him talk about how his father came to the United States about 40 years ago. Can you imagine?
Yes.
And so Negus is definitely not more than 40 because he was born here.
Yes, he was born here.
And yet, you can see how far he has gone. He is a United States of America lawmaker. And even within the context of being a lawmaker, like all members of Congress, he has distinguished himself by having the sort of skills that the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, could not resist, but actually appoint him to be one of the managers who were essentially prosecuting the case against a former US president. He is remarkably articulate. He is a remarkable achiever. And I honestly say this from the deepest, better part of the bottom of my Cavalry heart and soul. You know, I often tell you how I have been here for 44 years. So you can imagine the goose, about 40 years, his father has been here. Negus has moved on, man. He is right there.
Perhaps I should add that Negus is not the only person of color or immigrant serving in that Congress. We have other people who came in here as refugees who are serving as members of Congress.
I think that the fact that Negus and his colleagues, who, as you rightly said, happen to be essentially people of color, is testimony to the fact that this country, the United States of America, may not be perfect. It has a lot of faults. But at the end of the day, it is one of those few countries that we know of on this planet Earth that you could in fact come here from anywhere. That it does not matter where you come from and who you are. At the end of the day, as Lupita Nyong'o, the Kenyan Hollywood star who won the Oscar a couple of years ago, said, you can be validated.
Your dreams can be validated.
Yeah, this is a country where you could come in as a nobody, as an obscure individual, and you could come and take advantage of the social, economic, political, cultural, educational infrastructure. And if you can work hard, if you can focus on what you want, like a laser beam, with a bit of luck here and there, you can make it. And in fact, you could walk out of this country after, say, 20 years or so, with your head raised high. You can actually go for the gold. You can go to the stars.
Let's go to Nathaniel Isaac from Rukunjiri. Wow, that's my home district. He says, Mr. Shaka, thank you so much. I would like first to say thank you for your work that you do at the Voice of America, teaching democracy. As African countries go through spreading the words of peace, the rule of law, and people, not individuals, The example that we see from the United States is that doesn't matter who you are, you can still be held accountable. That brings me to the question, Shaka. Maybe let's talk about the rule of law. What we saw here, displayed here in the US Capitol, was one of those things that rarely or never happens in some African countries where we come from.
It is interesting that Nathaniel, your homeboy from the great town of Rukunjiri, is talking about the concept of accountability. But accountability is not really limited to the United States. You remember a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the legacy, for example, of a former Ghanaian leader, the late Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings, a man who believed in accountability and in making sure that government officials were there in those positions to serve the people. He believed that they had to account their decisions, their actions, their policies to the people. And as a matter of fact, there are some African countries, as I talk, which are on the right track. If you go to South Africa, for example, they have had 2 presidents who were recalled from office as presidents. The most recent one was a man popularly known as Mushorozi, Jacob Zuma. He was recalled from office before he could end his term because the ruling party, the ANC, was concerned about the direction that he was taking the country. Earlier on, Mr. Thabo Mbeki was also recalled from the presidency. That is what you call accountability. That is in fact close to the impeachment that we are talking about. And so there are some countries, very few, that in fact practice that. Because you see, there is no democracy if there is no accountability.
How about people who argue that at the end of the day, accountability is only a thing used by the victors? Let's say for people who, even in the particular case of President Trump's impeachment trial, because they could not get a conviction out of this trial, as far as a lot of people are concerned, this was a useless affair. It doesn't mean much because at the end of the day, there was nothing like justice. Justice was not dispensed at the end of the day. So I could argue that justice is also relative in this particular case.
On the contrary, first of all, history is very important. And it is not only important in the United States, it is important worldwide. You know, Donald J. Trump was the 45th president of the United States. But Donald J. Trump will always have an asterisk after his name as the only president, the only person, individual occupying the White House who has in fact been impeached twice in US history. The other people that have also had their share at being impeached also without being convicted are, for example, Bill Clinton, who was impeached once, and then you have Andrew Johnson, who was also impeached without being convicted. So those men, three men, they are always going to have an asterisk after their name that they were impeached. And that doesn't bode well for their legacy. So it is very significant, even though they were not convicted. It's not a good sign. It's not something that somebody would be proud of.
You gave some very good examples of former presidents who have been impeached. For example, when Bill Clinton was impeached, they revoked even his law license. He cannot practice law anymore. But in this particular case, Trump has been impeached twice, and there is nothing to show for it. This guy can still come and go about his business, even run for re-election, and chances are that he could actually give Joe Biden a run for his money.
First of all, we are talking about legacy here. I know that you and I come from a culture that sometimes minimizes legacy, that sometimes minimizes posterity, that sometimes tends to prioritize what is it that is there for me right now. But when you are talking about the kind of politics we are talking about, you are talking about being in a position where you offer yourself to be a servant of the people. You also have to think about character and integrity. The fact that you are a president of the United States, you have been impeached once or twice. It means there is an asterisk after your name. It means that your name is in the history books forever.
Let's go to Milward Suleimani. My question is on the impeachment of ex-President Donald J. Trump. Was it real or superficial?
The impeachment was serious business. It was not superficial. It was real. First of all, if he was in office, he could lose that office. And if he was convicted, there could probably have also been another vote where they would have voted on whether or not he should serve again in an elected capacity. So it is very serious business, Suleiman.
Let's go to Nana Efwa. Did the words of President Donald Trump incite the violence? And what does that mean for the freedom of expression or free speech, as Americans call it?
Free speech has nothing to do with inciting violence. Free speech does not allow any particular individual to incite violence or to take up arms to solve an issue or to address an issue. So when you talk about whether or not Mr. Trump's words may have incited the violence, even the senators, the Republican senators who voted against convicting him, did not pretend that his words did not incite violence. The only thing they had to use as a cover was that it was a procedural matter, that this man had already left office, went home, and that he was now a private individual. And therefore, they did not see any reason why they would convict him.
Okay, we'll end it there. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.